data unlocks this whole world where you can learn so much more about the players, you can learn about the coaches, and it all like comes together in a much deeper way. Last show we did together was last summer with Ben Gretsch.
Last summer.
Breaking ground, just phenomenal stuff. Brought up all the RPO stuff with
That's
Pittman.
right.
Everybody was out on him, and then he ended up having a really good year. So yeah, let's make some more magic.
Yeah, I feel here's the thing though, with the Pittman stuff, especially like the art. So for those of you who missed that discussion, it was one where Gretsch had done like a really quick, like high level look at RPOs and like the impact that RPOs may or may not have on fantasy football. And so I started talking to him and I had this epiphany of just wanting to dig into it a little bit more. I think I did an episode of Late Round Podcast on it in particular, and basically found that there is a lot of data that backs up what Gretsch was just generally talking about that was more of like a logic thing at the time. And the data being that teams that were heavy RPO seem to hyper target their number one wide receiver more than a team that wouldn't be running those heavy RPOs. And I think intuitively it makes sense because what an RPO is, you're either running or passing, right? And you have to make a read very, very fast and quick, right? And so in from the perspective of like Michael Pittman, that actually got me on Pittman more than where I was like off of Pittman last year, totally. And then the RPO stuff made me say, well, what if he is hyper targeted to some degree? And then I think this year though with Pittman, we're just seeing the effects of, you know, what a lot of people were afraid of last year of Anthony Richardson being starter for most of the year, you know?
I mean, I think he's got a back injury, man, and it's brutal.
Yeah, that too.
I've got back injury, and I would not be trying to, you know, take NFL hits. Like that's so crazy that he's even out there, honestly.
Yeah, that's what I've been dealing with a lower back the last like week or so, and I'm like, I don't understand how athletes like have to manage this and deal with this. Like back injuries have to be like the injury that's just most debilitating to human beings.
Your back and your core, that's like where everything starts with mobility. Like if your back is affected, like you're just totally thrown off. Like
you're a big gym rat, right?
Yeah, before I got started full time, I managed a fitness center. I'm super into yoga. I teach yoga. I really, really enjoy that. For sure. Always. And especially like with our job, you got to be intentional, right? About moving, because it's so easy to just sit here and just type away and hardly move at all. So yeah, for sure.
Has yoga influenced your mindset a lot over the last handful of years? We should just go over your journey in the space, because you and I go way, way, way back. And I don't think that connection has been made by a lot of folks who are seeing you now on the Twitter streets. You know, you're tweeting data all the time and growing your following and whatnot. I don't think people realize that we have like the Number Fire days and you working at Number and doing stuff at Number Fire. But take us back to where that was and how that started. And then I do want to hear though about like the yoga mindset and if that's like changed your perspective on what you're doing with your work.
Sure. Yeah, I think I can connect all of this because last week I went on the couch with Sigmund Bloom, and he asks a question for the guest at the end that's not related to fantasy. And his question for me was, Jacob, how are you so calm? It cracked me up because, like, knowing myself, having lived with myself my whole life, like, I think of myself as a total spaz. Like, I think I'm composed at this point, and I've like calmed myself down a lot. But that's because I come from a place of being like hyper reactive and like taking things personally, taking things too seriously, and like it's especially when you do this work, like you can't exist like that. You're gonna drive yourself crazy.
Oh, yeah, you can't,
because you can't be right all the time, and you definitely can't please people all the time. Like so if like you're worried about that as your validation, like you're gonna go out of your mind.
Yeah, it's funny. It's really funny. Like anytime I like post any sort of remote complaint about something, right? Someone will inevitably respond saying, why are you so sensitive or something like that, right? And I'm like, you have no idea how many things I don't respond to, number one. But also, like, you literally cannot make it in a space like this if you're going to be overly sensitive. It would drive you absolutely nuts. I mean, there are definitely things that everyone has a bad day and you're going to, you know, let something get to you more than it probably should. But it's funny that you bring that up because I like this is one of the careers where you absolutely cannot be that way. You know, like it will absolutely destroy, you know, your mentality, the way that you think, the way that you give advice and all of that.
For sure. Honestly, man, just being public facing at all has been crazy for me. Like I'm kind of a hermit. I would rather just not even be on social media, but I am like out here trying to, get the good news out, get the good word out about data and everything that I'm doing. And so there's a lot of pushback with that. And so Sigmund asked me how I'm so calm. And I think the reason I appear calm is because I do a lot of mindfulness kind of things like yoga and meditation and stuff like that to make sure that I know like each day I'm going into this, like I'm in control of my own container and what I let in. Like I'm the one who chooses what I let in. None of this other feedback has anything to do with me, most likely. Like, even if somebody's frustrated with me, it's most likely coming from something that's going on with them.
Exactly. Right.
And so that like yoga has definitely been huge. And there's a lot more with yoga that I think is beneficial for the body, for the spirit, for the mind and everything. But you can also help yourself handle the tumultuous NFL season if that's if that's necessary. If you're sick in the head and you're just obsessed with it like us, that would be a good thing to help break it up. But yeah, on the couch last week, Sigmund told me that he helped Heath Cummings get started like 15 years ago. And then Heath was actually a guest on Beyond the Box Score the following day last week. That's a podcast that Dan Schneier and I started this year. And Heath is who recommended me to CBS. And so lately I've definitely been like reflecting with a lot of gratitude on those who like paved the way for me to do this work. And then I get the DM from JJ asking if I want to come on, Perspectives. And like the first opportunity that I got to share my sickness with the world came from none other than JJ. Shout out Number Fire.
Yeah.
Absolutely love my time at Number Fire. Learned a ton there. And definitely shout out JJ because like you had a ton of patience with me. I was still in college.
Yeah, true, you were,
when I started writing for y'all. So like talk about growing pains, man. Like I felt so bad sometimes because JJ is just such a good guy. And he's like pouring into me, believing in me, like really trying to help me develop. And like, brother, I'm out here like partying and not sleeping.
Trust
and
me, I know. I
terrible work.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I always said to people who worked at Number Fire, because you're not the first guest on Perspectives because I like, Barrett was on, for instance, at one point, he talked about like a Frank Gore article that he did where it finally clicked and he got it. And that's when he realized like, oh, I could maybe do this. But like, I always told people whenever they were writing a Number Fire, because at the time too, we were really trying to scale our content business like a lot. I mean, this was how many years ago is this at this point? This was
like 9 years, 8 years.
Was it that long ago? Okay. And so like we were really trying to scale the content business. It was probably around the time that we maybe had just got bought by FanDuel or it was around that time of like the transition and stuff like that. So it was either we were trying to get purchased or we were in this phase where we wanted to prove our worth. Right.
Yeah. And so like 2016.
Yeah. So it was a little bit after the acquirement. And so it was one of those things though, where like, I always told people, so number one, there was a lot of content that we were trying to get out there. And we had a lot of contract workers and stuff and freelancers that were helping us achieve those goals. And there was always this clashing of, because I'm very much shocking, a quality over quantity kind of content creator, right? And so there was always a clash of folks, more on the business end wanting the quantity, which is anyone who wants to get in the content business, this is what you're going to run into all the time, is that the folks who are sort of managing the business are going to want to say, get as much stuff out there as you possibly can without really caring about the limitations and capacity issues that you might have. Whereas if you're passionate about the topic that you're writing about or talking about or researching, you're going to say, no, I can only put good stuff out there, right? So there's a constant clash of that. And so I had to balance that by managing a lot of these freelancers. And obviously, I was able to shout out Brandon Gadula and Jim Sonis and stuff who were able to come on full time and really help out with this and like see the vision and not, derail it at all. I mean, do the opposite. But it was just one of those things where like there were so many freelancers and contract writers that I had this vision of what the content should generally look like. I wanted you guys to have your own voices. That's not what I'm saying. I just mean like, it has to have the Number Fire tone and the Number Fire voice, right? And so I care deeply, selfishly, to get good content out from everyone. But then on top of that, it's like it can be a best of both worlds things where like we're both trying to accomplish sort of the same thing at the end of the day, right? Like that's what I've always never understood about certain editors and them being like really, really strict and kind of dicks to the folks that they're managing, because like what you guys are trying to achieve the exact same thing. It's not going to do any good to like destroy the other person. I mean, I'm sure you have emails from me that were scathing and rude and mean, but
Yeah.
but yeah, man, I mean, like it's fun to always like look back and see the folks who like kind of emerged from that tree and started to plant their own and go on and do their own thing. You being one of them, it's been awesome.
For sure, yeah, man. I think I carry the number fire tone through with me in my work now, and I think that a lot of people do, and that's because it's dope. Like, and it's all about attention to detail, and like the integrity of the work, and really like not just it is quality over quantity, and that is kind of rare in today's landscape. But at the same time, I do think that there are a lot of people who gravitate towards that, even though we're in kind of the doom scroll times right now. Like there are still a lot of people who, when they're getting real deep into this and just real like sick with it, like I've said several times, like they want that. They can tell the difference between like just surface level stuff and something that's authentic, where it's like this guy's a process. He's putting a lot, or guy or gal is putting a lot of time into what they're doing, thinking about what they're doing, and making sure it all makes sense and it's not just noise. Yeah,
100%. I think that like, I mean, that I wouldn't say that's like the sole reason that I left and went out on my own, but it was definitely a part of just like the whole package of like, hey, I can go write a 200-page draft guide and sell that and like get the diehards and get the folks who actually care about this stuff and the detailed stuff and get them to read what's been in my brain for a really long time. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing better than that for me. Like I totally agree. Like there's still a large portion. I think it can be a little bit defeating for folks who are out there trying to win in the content game, where they're trying stuff out and they just feel awful because Twitter thread bro is winning this game and getting all these followers and stuff like that. You don't have to win that way. I mean, you can win that way. Props to folks who are doing that. That's the way that they want to do it. But if you're more inclined to do some of the more detailed work and some of the more research oriented work and the heavy lifting stuff, you can still do that. There's still opportunity. There's always going to be opportunity for that kind of thing. And that's what seems like you've really kind of shifted towards and have become most interested in with the stuff that you're doing right now.
Yeah, man. Learn from the best.
I appreciate that. This episode is sponsored by Underdog. Underdog is the easiest place to play fantasy sports, and they give you a ton of different games and contests to choose from each week. If you think drafting is over because the season started, you'd be wrong. You can draft teams over there each week in literal minutes. Right now, if you sign up on Underdog with promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a deposit offer of up to $1,000, but you also get access to my rest of season rankings. Those will be emailed to you once you sign up. But when you sign up, you have to use promo code LATEROUND. Head to underdogfantasy.com or download the app to do so. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. You have really started to really make a name for yourself, if you will, like in the social media space, on Twitter, within the fantasy football space. And I love to see it. Like I said, like Barrett, it was the same way. It's just great to see folks who like I saw them at the start and now I see what they're doing now. And this is not a slight on you, but it is just night and day, right? Where like where you were to where you are now. It's just cool to see. It makes me feel really old and like a dad, but like at the same time, I do feel, it makes me feel a little special, to see that kind of growth and stuff happen. But you've really like shown off your love for data, and advanced data. And I know that, you're working, in the background, doing queries and looking at all of this data. Why do you think though, it's so important to do that, and what has really gravitated yourself and your brain towards that direction, aside from the fact that you wrote under me to start things off for you?
Yeah, so I'm just a guy, like I just got done doing a podcast, Beyond the Box Score, with Jamie Eisenberg, who's like a mensch in the fantasy community. He's been doing this work for so long, stood the test of time. So cool to hear him talk about his work. And he has like a journalism background, and he's a real, like he knows what he's doing. And I'm just some guy who likes football, who grew up playing Madden and watching football and being like, this is sick. And like, I think I could, I love it so much. And I feel like I could learn enough about it that I could like share that love with people, and maybe they would enjoy that. And that's where it starts for me. And I think data has been the entry point. Data is kind of like what helped me learn to love football deeper, and not just like be infatuated with it, but like truly love it and appreciate it on a deeper level. Because like when you start out, it's just like Jimmy Graham dunking on people and Demaryius Thomas, all right, rest in peace, just like gliding past defenses, and Reggie Bush just juking fools out of their shoes. And it's like, that's what gets your attention. But that's not like love, man. That's just like attraction. That's just like amazement. And like data unlocks this whole world where you can learn so much more about the players. You can learn about the coaches and the moving pieces and all that's going into this. And it all like comes together in a much deeper way. And before you know it, you're just deep into the nitty gritty of per play data and per route data and all this stuff. And that just keeps unlocking things. And now you're thinking about on a per play basis, which teams are running more, which teams are passing more, which teams are using play action on a higher percentage of their plays, or which teams are using pre-snap motion on a higher percentage of their plays. And how is that affecting things? Which teams are blitzing more on defense, which teams are using more press coverage or whatever. And all of this is available to you on a per play basis. It's not quite publicly available yet. Fantasy Points data is doing a really good job of making stuff like that accessible. Up until recently, it's been sort of gatekept relative to like baseball. There's so much analytics that's available for free. And basketball as well. But like football, it's been really hard to get your hands on this stuff, even for people like me and JJ. But like now I've got this opportunity with CBS, and I've got True Media, which is this awesome. You brought up like being able to query and stuff. Like I can just find this stuff right away. It's right at my fingertips. And so I just like get obsessed with it. And it's all data. Like, man, I don't understand exactly why, but I feel like we've got people get bent out of shape about data. It almost feels like this is obviously a dramatic way to say it, but it almost feels like there's like trauma around data. Where like people, they're presented with it, they see it, and I think it's just because people use it in a misleading way a lot, or people attribute meaning to data when that's not necessary at all. Data doesn't really mean anything. It only describes something. It's only like it just exists. It's not here to prove anything wrong or right. We can use it that way if we want, but like it's just a tool. And so like I wish that we didn't have to be intimidated by it or grossed out by it or whatever, because it feels like so many people just like don't, if it comes up, there's like a block. And really it's like data isn't even specific to football at all. Like data is all around us. We're all collecting data all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. Like we use data to make decisions. It's data is all the fun and surprising details that you learn about someone to like piece together parts of their personality, you know. And it doesn't even have to, that metaphor doesn't have to be like a person. That could be anything, like an idea or a new place or a story or whatever. Like it's the little details you learn that resonate with you. But those details are surface level. Like it's just a description, you know. Does that click?
Yeah.
Like it's just
I think though that the other point to this, in terms of like the pushback that folks will get when even just referencing data, like for instance, I'll do my data dump every week on Twitter, and then on Blue Sky now too, and I'll throw out all like 50 different stats that are pretty high level, just target share stuff and like route participation stuff, because people obviously care about usage in fantasy football. It's the number one thing that we should care about. And there are times where I get responses from people that are basically yelling at me for something that is completely and utterly objective. Like there's not even a take attached to any of these tweets, right? And this has been happening for literally since I started doing all of this. And fortunately, I think it happens less and less because people are more and more okay with data in football. But it rocks the establishment. Like that's what this comes down to. This isn't me trying to be like, oh, we're edgy and cool because we use data. This is me saying that football is a game that inherently, has not been super like intellectual from a data perspective, right? Like from that, it's very intellectual from a leadership perspective, and from even like an X's and O's strategery perspective. Like incredible, like some of the smartest people in sports have been like football coaches and quarterbacks and so that's not what I'm saying. Like people can still be smart. I'm just saying from a data perspective, and the sole reason for that is because we don't have the 1-to-1 A to B connections that a game like baseball does, or even a game like basketball does, where we are dealing with 11 human beings playing against 11 human beings. And this is where like the discussion of like momentum comes into play, where people, data people will say momentum's not real, but then all of the athletes will come out and they'll say, oh, momentum is real. And I think that anyone, who's played sports before, and this is, again, that goes back to like, oh, you've never played football before, you've never played a sport before, you've never, you're just sitting in front of your computer, you have no idea what you're talking about. I actually think that momentum individually is 100% a thing, because we've all been in a flow state before, like we've all been in situations where things are just clicking and we hit on everything and we're crushing it, whether it's with your work, whether it's with a run that you're on, whether you're at the gym lifting, whatever it is. You can get playing video games, you can get in a flow state where your brain is sort of in that like next level place. Now, I don't know how contagious flow state is, right? But I do think that your surroundings enable you and help you to get into that flow state. And so if you have 11 people on offense and 4 or 5 of them are in that flow state all at once, that to me is what momentum would be, right? It's not that the entire offense and all, because if the quarterback's not, and then he throws an interception on the next play, that's where the data comes out and says momentum's not real, because everyone screams momentum whenever a team scores 17 unanswered. And then that same quarterback then goes and throws an interception. So how is momentum real? Well, it could still be real with every other player that's functioning in that offense or even on the defense. It's just that one player is the one who made that mistake. And so what I'm getting at is, I think that part of like the dissonance in what you're talking about with data here is that people reject it because there's just such a gray area involved, right? Like there's everything that I've ever written about and talked about, aside from fading Zamir White this year. No, everything that I've written about has been a gray area, has had a gray area conclusion, because nothing is for certain. Aside from Zamir White not being a good draft pick this year.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. But like nothing is for certain. We can assign probabilities to those things. Like go back to the Zamir White thing. Did I like Zamir White entering the season? No. Did I recognize there was a possibility that White could return value and maybe even be a high-end RB2 this year? Yes, of course. We're taking all these different inputs and recognizing that, it's like the folks' theory about the universe and how there's so many different realities, and that, me moving my right hand here, in another reality, I didn't move my right hand, and another reality, all these different things are unfolding. There's a reality where Zamir White was a higher end RB2. It's just that we're associating these probabilities to these outcomes, and then we're weighing those things, what we see as appropriately, and then we're saying, this is what I think is going to happen. And part of the problem that I see, at least with data, is that, like you're saying, it's a descriptive thing, and we are at the end of the day trying to create narratives around what the data is saying. And the issue, though, is when people are very declarative with those narratives and the way that they talk about them, and they assume that anything that they're discovering is factual, when things that you're seeing aren't factual. It goes both ways, don't get me wrong, but I think that it's important for two data folks to hop on and critique our side of things, because one of the things that drives me nuts more than anything is you're wrong, I'm right, because yards per route run says this. It's like, we got to get over that,
Yeah. I started to just kind of like meander around a metaphor, and I think I can fully place it now. So truly, like, I do think the metaphor I'm going to give is like, you're falling in love with someone and you have all this data that you're collecting, and some of it might be alarming. And I can speak to this personally as somebody who comes from a background of like not really trusting people and like having walls up all the time and being very like judgmental in how I view things, like thinking like I have this conception of like what reality is, and if this doesn't fit into it, or if I've seen something similar like this before, I start to make assumptions.
Yeah.
That's so limiting.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happens with data a lot is like, what if you could instead approach it with curiosity rather than judgment? You would learn a lot. It would totally like widen your scope of possibilities. And so like there are 11 men on the field, and all of this data that we have for football is very complex because of that. And so like that, to me, like the metaphor would be like, you might have seen behavior like this before with this person, but you don't know the why at all. You only know the what. And so like when you learn the why, it's like, wow, this person had this crazy thing happen in their life that led them to be this way. And so now they're very scared or they're very whatever. And that it manifests itself in how they act. And the assumption that I made was totally wrong. It was just based off of my own experiences, which could never have perceived their perception because I had never experienced anything similar. And then like taking it back to data, like that's a really dramatic, cheesy, like real life way to like talk about football data. But it's like there are like every offense is different. Every team and player is different. And so like a yard per route run rate for Jalen Waddle is completely different than a yard per route run rate for a player who plays in an offense with 3 receivers on the field all the time. The offense doesn't like, Jaden Reed. Sure. Jaden Reed plays with, let's say he's out there with Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. Those guys aren't necessarily big target earners. Yeah. And then the other point that's important to know is that when there are 3 receivers on the field, per route data is significantly lower than when there are 2 receivers on the field or when there's 1 receiver on the field, because there's less target competition. If you're competing with a fullback for a target as opposed to a wide receiver, if you're competing with a tight end or a running back as opposed to a wide receiver, like that's a big difference. And so that's borne out where it's, I think, like a 30 or 40% difference between 2 receivers and 3 receivers per route data. And so like you look, if you just like saw, you know, the Tyreek Hill's yard per route run rate is way higher than Justin Jefferson's. That's another great example. Plays tons of 3 receiver sets. You might be inclined to say that's stupid. Like this stat is pointless. And then if you just never give it a second thought, just because you think you know what's right, and like then you aren't able to use that stat to identify Nico Collins as a breakout. Yeah. Or Puka Nakua's yard per route run rates were great in college. Maybe you wouldn't be. I mean, that's nobody was doing that. But like Josh Downs, amazing per route data. You know, like you would just write off that stat entirely, and like you just if you're resistant to the data, you are just creating a cage for yourself. And it's totally, you don't have to do that. Like the data doesn't have to be intimidating or challenging or anything. It could be inviting. It's literally just a description of what's happened. You have agency over how you view it and use it. If you see someone misusing it, that doesn't have to affect you in any way. You don't have to get mad about it or anything. Yeah. You don't have to assume that the stat is wrong. You can assume the person's wrong if you have to assume anything. I don't know, like, or you could just leave it and not think about it again. Right. I don't know. It's crazy to me because data can be so useful. And the fact that, like, for me, it really did get me, it was an entry point to learning more and more about the game. So I want to shout out Nate Tice, who does incredible work for Yahoo Fantasy these days. Football 301 podcast he does with Matt Harmon. Matt is a friend of the show, of course. Just so cool that those two are making content together. Nate Tice is who kind of unlocked this deeper level of love for football for me. So like I said, that data is kind of like the getting to know people, the surface level information. Nate Tice got me where I'm really, instead of like just the surface level, I'm going deeper. I'm like watching, like really, really watching. And I think we can kind of draw this metaphor back to the person where it's like, instead of just assuming something about them based on the data, you actually sit down, shut up and listen to them and watch them and observe them. And like, that's how you actually get deep with someone or with something. That's how you actually learn to like love something in a deep way, is like really observe it and like listen to what people like Nate say, but also like listen to what coaches say. Dude, have you noticed how much Jim Harbaugh loves Justin Herbert?
Oh yeah. It's so did you see fun. The clip of him catching a pass from him the other day? Yeah, and like he dropped it and he's like, "Oh, I got to get it." And like he's it's fascinating to me to see, like, this is why, like, I've been a Mike Tomlin truther for forever, because I'm from Pittsburgh and I have a ton of friends still from there that live there and that I grew up with, that every year over the last 5 to 7 years, they'll get on Facebook after a Steeler game when they lose and they will just rip Mike Tomlin. Like, they will just say, I don't think people realize how good of a leader and motivator Mike Tomlin is. Like, it is. It's and now we're obviously seeing it this year to a decent degree with how he handled the quarterback situation and how well they're just generally playing now. But it's crazy how like that kind of like attitude and like your mood adjustment, if you will, can really shift, and your mentality can just shift everything. Can shift like look at what's going on in Washington right now. Like Dan Quinn completely changed the culture of that team. And they're now, and by the way, we're recording this before the Thursday night game. I should throw that caveat out there. Completely changes the culture of that team. And the more that I've done this, it's almost like that one parabola meme that's out there, where like once you get like really nerdy and really data driven about this, like you think that you have all the answers and stuff, but really at the end of the day, you then sort of realize you don't have the answers, and you go back to you could use that meme to think about like leadership is everything in football, and then looking at all this data, and then at the end realizing leadership is everything in football, right? Like just going back to that very basic concept. But I think that's what like I've realized a lot over the years is that, and you can see it all the time when folks like first get into the fantasy space, they really start to like gain a following and listeners and stuff like that. And especially if they're data driven people, but even if they're not data driven people, it's just easy to say data driven because most analysts in the fantasy space are going to be more data driven because it's a numbers driven game. But so frequently, and I see it all the time, the first year where they have a big following and they're really excited, understandably excited about that because they have people that are listening to their takes. They are so unbelievably bold with the way that they speak about players, right? And then they get humbled, right? Yeah. And then the very next year, they're sitting back a little bit more, right? This is what happens. It's because not only do you realize how much gray area there is, but you start to realize that the stuff that you're looking at does not include all of the answers to your problems and your questions. And I think that's what we're really getting to is that like, yards per route run, standalone, not even adjusting. It's a good metric. Like it is a fine metric. It's part of my models that I use. Like it is a good metric. Do I think that and I'll reference it all the time, right? But do I think that I can solely judge a player's skill level? Like Jackson Smith and Jigba, perfect example. Yeah. Do I think that JSN's, now he's at like 1.58 or something because of that, the last game he had. But do I think that his yards per route run is indicative of how good and talented of a player he is? No, because there's other inputs that I'm looking at. Like I still care about the kind of prospect he was. I care about what my eyes are seeing. I care about what's happened in the limited sample that we've had where he hasn't had one of DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett. Like I care about all of these other factors. It's just that when we dumb things down to only yards per route run, that can get you in trouble. When you use yards per route run in conjunction with other things, that's when you can start to really paint a picture and tell a better story.
Yeah, you're just scratching the surface. Like, and that's why I brought up Nate is because like you do start to get a deeper appreciation and like understanding of like how all the moving pieces affect each other, and you do start to get more curious about like what's really going on in terms of watching it on the field and listening to the coaches and all that. Shout out Coach Speak Index is so good. Yeah. They've the one that have really like put me on the Harbaugh stuff. Like just look at the difference between Quentin Johnson last year and this year. Obviously it's year 1, year 2, but also I think it really makes a difference. There's a coach who repeatedly states his belief in him. And of course this is not a fantasy take for QJ. There's been some, like he's probably been the luckiest receiver in the NFL.
Yeah, he probably has.
Scoring on busted coverages and everything. But like also he is catching them and scoring, and he has made some plays that he just wasn't making last year. I really do think that makes a difference. And that's like the next level to like really falling in love with. And I think data, as it pertains to data, I think data can be the key to unlocking that deeper love for football, where you start getting just more curious about all of these things. And maybe that's even from getting frustrated with data or whatever, where maybe data leads you to an incorrect conclusion. And if you're willing to then like challenge what your process was, challenge your assumptions and dig back into that, you find that like you didn't have this other piece of information. Like here's some data for you, JJ. I'm 5'9". That's a stat. You would maybe think based off that like I played basketball, like 5'9", like probably not doing anything around the rim, right? Just like a little guy. Here's another stat. This is all this was just a setup for me to brag. I had a 37.5-inch vertical.
Ooh, look at that.
So what if you just have that stat though, and not the first one? You're like, that guy's probably a rim protector or something. And it's like, no, like the two stats work together, and one without the other doesn't tell you anything. Yeah. And like that, I don't know, like you start to follow the trail and like learn more and more, even if it is like your process was wrong, you start to unlock things and get more and more curious about how it all works together. And like, I just go check out Nate Tice's work if you don't, because there's few people who I enjoy listening talk about football more than him. because it's beyond data for sure.
Yeah, and he loves it. You can tell he loves it. He's very
Yeah.
enthusiastic when he's talking about it. It's great. You know, the point that you made about sort of these metrics like working in conjunction and not looking at things standalone, I think is very, very appropriate when it comes to prospecting work. You know, like I fine tune my prospect model every single offseason because part of it is because I'm just a nerd and I just love doing it and like digging into data that I might have not had before or thinking of different ways to manipulate the very basic data that we have for college football because it's not nearly as good as what we get with the NFL. But a really good example of that is I've always told people, if you want like a very basic way to analytically solve the running back position, obviously look at like draft capital. That's the number one thing. But I'm saying like more so like a later round pick who might be able to do something and make noise that we wouldn't otherwise expect. There's like two things. I mean, maybe three if you want to just say like athleticism and like straight line speed and just like adjusted 40, right? So speed score. But aside from that, it's literally, is the guy big and did he catch a lot of balls in college? Like is he a big running back who showed off as a receiver? Now that alone as a descriptor doesn't really make that much sense. But really what it tells you when you really think about like the narrative that you can draw from that, what it tells you is that he's probably a pretty agile player to be able to do more than just see work on the ground. And then usually the signal for receiving work in college is that his team is trying to get him the ball in a lot of different ways. I say it all the time. A good receiver in college doesn't mean that he's going to be a good receiver in the NFL, but it means that he could be a good player in the NFL because he was getting work in a lot of different ways. Very, very similar to, we see pretty good correlation between like wide receivers who had decent rushing production. That was one of the reasons why my model liked Ricky Pearsall more than other like numbers driven models did, is because he got a lot of work done on the ground and he did stuff as a returner, and like that kind of additional stuff doesn't get a lot of love usually, but it's a signal that the team itself is trying to use him in that way. And those little signals are sort of what we're talking about here. It's the intent. It's the the reason as to why players are doing what they're doing. You know, it starts at the coaching level. It starts at the team level to see how they're really deploying these guys and what they're intending to do with them at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's the why. That's what it keeps coming back to. Like, and that's why like data isn't the why, but it gets you to it. And that's so just if you can approach it with curiosity, like you just start learning more and more. And next thing you know, you are creating and backtesting intricate fantasy football models. Dude, I listened to the episode with Dwayne McFarland last night, and it was so fun, like so funny. Like you guys are both just like complete nerds, complete minches, like of men, just doing the Lord's work. And like
very nerdy episode. Probably the nerdiest. Probably the nerdiest episode of Perspectives that I've ever done.
So good.
We went from, and we're doing it kind of here too, but we went from like having like a 10, 11 question show sheet to literally talking about two things the entire time. Yeah. Dude,
his process on how to handle fab free agent bucks was like so fun.
Really good.
To.
I
love Dwayne. If you guys are curious about that and haven't listened to that, give that one a listen to. That'll be a good grounding episode, like to complement this one. I feel like I have a tendency to get people's heads in the clouds and be like, this is so cool. But like, I hope people realize how valuable you and Dwayne are. Like y'all,
thank you.
I'm not just saying that like to suck up to you. Like I feel like you guys are doing smarter and like higher integrity research than is being done in so many workforces, and that's so silly because we're talking about fantasy football.
It's so worthless. Like it's just trust me, dude. I've had so many existential crises in my life of like, I just spent this much time researching something that literally does not matter at all. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's like the entertainment, it's the escapism. I know people are going to hit me up and be like, don't think like that. Don't act like that. But like at the end of the day, like it's not that important. But I will say, and I'm sure you've gotten this too, one of the most like thrilling feelings that you could possibly, like family aside, like birth of your child and getting married, all that kind of stuff. One of like the best day-to-day feelings that you could feel is when you discover something like through research. It doesn't, I don't think it has to do with fantasy football. I think it's just the discovery aspect, right?
Eureka.
Yeah, exactly. You have that moment and then you get to share it with everyone. There is nothing that gets me more hype than when, I have an episode of Late Round Podcast that I did some research on some very specific topic that people haven't really thought about before. And I publish it and people were like, I never thought about the game this way. Right.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that is that is literally what drives me to do this every day, is because it's just fun. Like, it's fun to do that.
It is fun. And that's got to be the approach that we take with data. I feel like is like, just have fun with it. It's way less serious about data, especially as it pertains to football and fantasy football. Like, it's not serious at all.
Yeah. Well, here, let me ask you this, because I think that this plays into what we've been talking about. Do you think we've gotten to a point in the fantasy football space where there's just an oversaturation of data? Like, there's just way too many numbers. People are trying to solve something that is not solvable the way they think it's solvable, and it's gotten a little out of hand. I mean, I know that people are probably sick of hearing me talk about the ZAP model, and they're like, can you just talk about football and stop referencing this stupidly named model and get to the point? So like I understand there's frustration. Like, do you think that we've gotten to a point of oversaturation, or what do you think the problem is with that whole idea? Like, do you think there's an issue with there just being too many numbers out there and not enough, people being concise with those numbers?
I don't think there is a problem. I think that I just don't like problem. It just rubs me the wrong way to think about it that way. Like it is what it is. It's going to exist this way. Like, I'll just say, so I'm really glad you asked this question, because it's one that I posed to multiple guests on Beyond the Box Score, the podcast that I started. And like, no one has been brave enough to just say yes. I wonder if it is because like I'm one of the prime offenders of taking stats too far, and maybe people don't want to say it. I don't know, but like, I'll say it. Yes, the fantasy football data train has long since derailed.
Yes,
we are
agreed.
Way off the rails. Totally, like, not a question. But the reason I say it's not a problem is like, that is going to happen either way, and it's personally up to like you. What are your goals? Like, why are you interested in football, in fantasy football? Like, in my opinion, it really is a question of like, what's important to each person? Like, what's the best experience for you? Why do you play fantasy football? So like, JJ, you're a Funko fanatic, I think. Is that fair to say? I see him behind you. I got
a good bit behind me.
A few? Yeah. So I have a friend who's an absolute Funko fiend. He has a collection that is like, it's got to be over 100 deep at this point.
I'm sure they probably keep them in the box and all that kind of stuff too.
No. He's got them all displayed. He's got like collections, and it's like different. Like, this is my Naruto one, and it's like all the like characters associated with each other and everything. And so often he'll send me a Snapchat of some absurd new Funko with the question, "Have I lost the plot?" And invariably, I respond by assuring him that he has not lost the plot. It's become like a bit of an unspoken bit between us at this point. No matter how ridiculous the Funko, he gets joy from this. He's responsible about the way that he spends his money. He allows himself to explore this bizarre hobby and continues to find joy in it. And like, I will never tell him that he has lost the plot unless he like actually, wants me to be accountable with him or whatever. Like, but I don't think that's what we're doing. And so like, why do you play fantasy football? If it's to have fun or deepen your enjoyment of the NFL, then hell yeah. Like, welcome to the dank data world. Follow me on Twitter, Cannonball at the Deep End. There's no losing the plot. If that is like inconceivable for you because you play for competition, you play to make money, you're in the right place. Listen to JJ. Like, he will not steer you wrong and will not allow you to lose sight of what's actually important in being a successful player. So like, that would be my answer, I guess. I do think that like, as an analyst, you have a responsibility to make sure that like, you contextualize the data that you use and you help people understand it. And so I do my best to do that in the FFT newsletter. I write that. It's free. You can Google FFT newsletter, Jacob Gibbs newsletter. You'll find it. I don't want to mislead people, for sure. I want people to be able to follow along with what I'm saying, even be able to do their own research and all that. I want people to be able to trust me, to be well informed, to be able to like responsibly participate in the discourse that I do facilitate. But like, I can't account for every person, especially on Twitter. Like, when it comes to Twitter, I have to just like acknowledge that like some of the information that I share is going to a team at times like lead to misuse. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, is that my responsibility to like only share actionable predictive data? Like, I think on Twitter, I'm just a guy who likes football. And I'm just like, here's this cool, like, I don't know, like, I'm just like, here's the defenses that are using the most stunts.
Yeah.
And it's like, what does this mean? What do you mean? What does it mean? It means exactly what I said. That's all that it means. Like, I just think it's cool that like these defenses are different than others. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm very curious to hear what you think about it. Cause like, yes, I'll just name my guys from Fantasy Points data. Like, we're off the deep end. We're coming up with new stats. Does average separation score like matter for fantasy? Maybe, but we don't know. They're literally in the beta phase. Like they're dropping new stats every day and like coming up with new stuff. And like maybe there is an oversaturation. I don't know, but like I don't think that's wrong as long as you're coming from a place of like intentionality and mindfulness when you do create and share those. Like they've got like read a Ryan Heath article at Fantasy Points Data. Like that's the closest I've come to JJ Zacharyson, like in terms of like attention to detail and laying out the whole process behind his research and everything that he's done to get him to this point. And then here's the information. They've got tutorials and everything on Fantasy Points Data. They give you the process. They're very transparent about the charting that they're doing and all that. So like I think the people who are at the core of like bringing new information to the forefront of the industry and spreading that information are you and Dwayne and those guys. Like I think they're very intentional and mindful with that responsibility, and that's all that you can ask. I think the people who are really not are just like aggregates, and like that's going to exist at the like adoption stage of like anything, you know. Like I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that I do think that there is an oversaturation with some of these metrics. And I don't think that it's necessarily anyone's fault. You know, yeah. I think that what we're seeing right now is there's access, there's better access to data, as we talked about before. The access is still gate kept to some degree, right? Like you having access to true media is something that 99% of even analysts are not going to have access to, because
literally 1,000 people a year ask me what it is, and it's like I'm sorry, like
yeah,
it's
right,
not.
Right, and it's a very like just straight up, it's an expensive thing too that people just can't afford, right? And so like that's part of it too. That's why it was like really exciting that Next Gen Stats was going to have their $100 product that they came out with, which has been good. It's not like amazing because you're not querying stuff and stuff like that, but like it's still a relatively decent product that gives you some baseline numbers and stuff like that. Or like Fantasy Life even has some pretty good metrics that you can unlock. But my thing is, you know, it just goes back to I do think that there is like some sort of onus on us as analysts, and you said this too, to at least contextualize what we're saying and not just throw out the data and make the assumption that people know what to do with that data, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I know that I sort of do that with the data dump, but the stuff that I'm doing with the data dump is very, very high level type stuff. Like it's just usage stuff, right? It's not, hey, here's this separation metric that needs a lot of detail or like needs a lot of context around it. And I'm not calling Fantasy Points out here either, because like you said, they are transparent, you know, with that process. My thing is, I think there's a lot of power that you have that others have that will tweet out the data stuff. And then I've even seen it on my Discord where people then use that tweet or that data point to then when they're chatting with folks in the Discord to argue for or against, you know, a certain guy. And then I see it and I'm like, okay, guys, number one, like, let's be civil here. But number two, like, here's where, you know, like, and I try to provide some of the context of what that data might be saying, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not like calling, I'm just saying like, yeah, of course, like you're tweeting stuff all the time with data and stuff. So of course your name has been thrown out there at times, but like JSN's a really good example of that, where like, again, if we were to tweet out that JSN's yards per route run has been bad, you know, is that predictive for future performance? Yeah. I mean, there is predictiveness to yards per route run. We know that, but we also know that there are these other factors that aren't necessarily being put in, like even ADOT, you know, like ADOT affects yards per route run. Quarterback play affects yards per route run. And it's almost like when we talk about yards per route run, we're, you know, I'm guilty of it too. Like I'll go through, okay, this guy's yards per route run is 2.2. He's been good. This guy's only at 1.1. We usually don't see guys with that low of a yards per route run rate do X, Y, and Z moving forward. But at the same time, you know, I'm looking at Cedric Tillman right now, who last year had a historically bad yards per route run rate, like horrific. Like Cedric Tillman was one of the worst rookies efficiency wise that I've looked at over the last decade. Right. And then he steps into this role, and how I've approached it is I haven't been very aggressive, admittedly, with Tillman, and that might end up being an L. I'm still grounded in the fact that he wasn't very efficient last year, but you can't be so grounded in that fact that you ignore what he was dealing with. And what he was dealing with was an absolute just atrocious, just one of the worst quarterback situations you could possibly find in the NFL, right? Or a situation where, he is competing with some other pass catchers where that yards per route run might fall a little bit. Or, there's all of these different factors that go into play. You go back to yards per route run with Green Bay last year, and, I'm a Jaden Reed truther, so of course I'm saying, yeah, dude, his yards per route run was so great last year. He's a stud, blah, 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 blah. And he is a stud, right? But it is interesting that we kind of ignored the fact that Bo Melton had a really good yards per route run rate. And then you're like, well, maybe, just maybe, this is a team-oriented thing just as much as it was a Jaden Reed thing. You know what I mean? And so, and I'm looking at it right now. One of my number one examples of this, in my opinion, right now is Jalen Waddle, because everyone is trashing Waddle right now. And I get it. He has not had, and this is not, people are going to say this is cope because I liked Waddle entering the season. It's not, this is, I've taken the L. We're done with that. This is me just trying to look at this objectively. But Jalen Waddle right now, he's been bad through like across the board compared to where we've typically seen Jalen Waddle, right? But the thing that is just not being put into context is that Tyreek Hill has been bad across the board compared to what we're typically seeing. From Tyreek Hill has still been better than Jalen Waddle, but I would argue strongly that the worst pick in fantasy football this year is not Christian McCaffrey. It's not Jalen Waddle. It's Tyreek Hill. Because in Tyreek Hill's case, you're spending a top 5 pick on the guy and you're never benching him.
Right.
And he's giving you 11 PPR points in a given week if he scores, right? He's not giving you these Tyreek Hill games, and he's sinking your fantasy rosters. Whereas if you have Christian McCaffrey, McCaffrey, you're not taking a 0 whenever McCaffrey is out of the lineup. And so Tyreek Hill has had a bad year, and Jalen Waddle has had a bad year. And so you have to then look at the team level stuff and say, okay, what's going on? Well, they've been targeting their tight ends a lot more. They've been targeting their running backs a lot more. Their offensive line is not great, as we know. I mean, it hasn't really been great throughout the McDaniel era, but it's, we saw Tua under pressure a lot last week against the Rams. The Rams can generate pressure, but we saw Tua under pressure. And then you have to think about, well, are they doing something? This is us talking about sort of like the intent stuff and sort of the read between the lines stuff. Are they doing something different because they want to save Tua's health and they want to make sure that something crazy doesn't happen again? Who knows? Like, we don't know those answers, but some of the things that I'm talking about, the poorer offensive line, the lower A dot, getting the ball out to a running back or a tight end, easier targets to just get to quick. That all points to maybe they're changing it up because of these other circumstances that were not really that predictable at the beginning of the season. And so I do think what I'm really getting at here is that when we just look at it and say Jalen Waddle without context, right, has had a bad year. What that's going to do is that in the future, you're going to assume that Jalen Waddle is a bad football player when we have 4 years of data showing that or 3 years of other data showing that he's a really good football player, right? We have way more data showing that he's good than he's bad. And just because the most recent thing is showing that he's bad and you're not giving any context to that, I think that's where bad process comes into play. And so when you or me or Dwayne or whoever goes out to Twitter and has a one-off tweet about Jalen Waddle's yards per route run rate, I do think that it's important, if someone at least comes back to us and says something to us about, well, blah, 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 to at least recognize, yeah, there's a lot more context, or to maybe even preface that there's a lot more context to that kind of thing.
For sure. Yeah. Another thing we didn't bring up with Waddle is it's been matchup dependent. They've played a ton of defenses that like funnel targets the running backs.
Exactly. Like the Bills twice, right? Like the
Bills, Cardinals.
Yes.
That's 60% of his games with Tua.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, Jalen Waddle, I've been going on a crusade. It's like this guy averaged more yards per run collegiate career than anyone drafted from 2020 on. That's CeeDee Lamb, that's Jamar Chase, that's Devontae Smith, widely considered the best collegiate receiver of all time. He's insanely good. Yeah. Let's not lose sight here.
Yeah, right. And the other thing though too is that like with data and with these ideas, because like I love coming up with general ideas and narratives that can sort of help like communicate the ideas in a better way, right? So like ambiguous backfields, right? Started discussing this like 8 or 9 years ago. And when I talked about it, it's a very easy to sort of like understand thing. And then I'm going to provide data with it and stuff like that. One of the things too, I do a lot of research with like ADP data. And one of the things that popped up multiple times over the last handful of years, but in particular this year, was that team wide receiver twos who were drafted as wide receiver twos. So I'm talking wide receiver 13 to 24 in ADP, and they're their team wide receiver twos. So Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith. They've actually been better than the alternative historically by ADP in terms of like exceeding ADP and such. And so I don't think you, like I said earlier, the offseason, like I don't think you have to go out of your way to obtain those players, but don't fade those players because they're their team's wide receiver too, is really what I concluded with it. So now people see Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith not living up to expectation this year without putting context around that. The context of Jalen Waddle that we just talked about, Devontae Smith, the Eagles have thrown the fewest pass attempts per game in football. Like they're not, they have the fewest targets per game in all of football. And so naturally a guy who he's still seeing decent enough target shares. It's just that they're not throwing the ball nearly as much as what any of us projected. If we knew that the Eagles were going to be last in the league in total targets per game this year, Devontae Smith wouldn't have been a wide receiver too. He wouldn't have been drafted that way, you know? And so I do think it's just really, really important to not say like, oh, well, wide receiver twos, no matter what, they're going to work out or they're better. No, there's just so much context that's necessary and needed there.
For sure.
Yeah.
I love, like I called you and Dwayne grounding forces. It's because you do research like that. Like I would love to do that stuff, but I'm mostly like just so obsessed with the player and coach stuff that I just like get so deep into that world. But that stuff is important for sure.
My favorite thing in the world is ADP, like analyzing market trends and trying to like beat the market that way and be smarter than the market. Cause I just think there's a lot to be gleaned there. And there's a lot of analysts that just aren't doing that work too. And there's an opportunity for it. All right. Before we end this, before I let you go, I want to really quickly talk about metrics that you think are overrated and underrated. So is there a metric out there that you think is really undervalued and underrated right now? And then on the flip side, a metric or two that are overrated?
Absolutely. First downs per route run, I wanted to talk about. And while we're here, I really do think that we should be playing in point per first down leagues more than PPR. I think that makes sense. First downs are more important in moving the chains, scoring touchdowns, winning football than receptions. I started one this year and it's been really fun. I have some examples, but I kind of want to avoid the players just because I think it would be fun to do an entire podcast and not give any actionable takeaway.
Yeah, it'd be great. That'd be awesome. Yeah, we have no player takes throughout this entire thing.
I'll give some player takes. First down per route run. Ryan Heath researched it and really brought this more into the forefront of, I think, the fantasy football consciousness this offseason. Higher correlation to fantasy production than yards per route run, which is really interesting because yards per route run has kind of been the holy grail for wide receiver stats. And it's also not just is it like has it been predictive, it's also important to go like hand in hand with yards per route run because yards per route run can be really influenced by big plays. Whereas like an 80-yard touchdown to George Pickens really boosts that yard per route run rate. It's just one first down. And then, I do think it also might be, I want to research this more, might be a signal to like a player who becomes really important in the offense. If they're converting first downs, then maybe the offense starts to give them more and more looks because that is really important. And so Juwan Jennings, always been good at converting first downs. Third and Juwan. He is awesome. All of his per route data on the year is awesome. He pops in first down per route run rate as well. And I think he legitimately might be a league winner for people. I know that people push back on that because they're like, this guy has been a wide receiver 4 for his whole career and now he's going to be a league winner. Maybe. I mean, he's been behind some of the best players in the NFL, like on the San Francisco 49ers. And he is 4th in yards per route run on the year. And like of all players, like behind just Nico Collins, AJ Brown, and Justin Jefferson. And now he's stepping into this expanded role, basically playing the Brandon Ayuk role. He has really good separation scores. He's very, very good against press coverage. They're facing a press coverage heavy team this week, and a lot of them down the stretch. The other thing is the Niners have the second highest projected point total from Vegas carrying forward for the fantasy playoffs from this point on. Only the Lions are expected to score more points. So I think that we're going to see some big fantasy point totals in San Francisco. And then another stat that's really good, this is also available at Fantasy Points data, is first read target rate. And he completely dominated that for San Francisco this past week. I think it was 39% of the first read targets went to Juwan. So really psyched about him. Mark Andrews, I would bring up in terms of first downs per route run. I think he's top 5. I just tweeted this out. Jonnu Smith, by the way, is first. That's a bit fluky.
Yeah.
But in terms of first downs per route run at the tight end position, Mark Andrews is third, behind only Jonnu Smith and George Kittle. Just behind those guys are Trey McBride, Brock Bowers, Travis Kelce. So it's a stable stat. It's not a fluky stat. I say it's fluky for Jonnu Smith because his route rates have been about 50% on the year. And so his sample size is smaller than the rest of these tight ends. And that's sort of coming into play here with Andrews too.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
But I do think there have been some encouraging underlying data points for Andrews all year. And I think it's possible that we're seeing him round back into form. He did have that car crash, and like that could be something that affects him. Like that is a traumatic incident that happened to him right before the start of the season. And then he's going into a high contact sport. And I don't know. I have no idea what that's like. But we have seen him looking more like himself lately. And I just think he's interesting because a lot of people have left him for dead.
The thing with Andrews that scares me is just simply, are they going like the question is not talent for me. It's just, are they going to you? Because like, it's no coincidence that he saw a 94% route share last week because Isaiah Likely was out. You know what I mean? And so like the question really comes down to, are you going to believe that they use him more? Or are you going to believe that they don't use him more? Or that they're going to revert back to the most of the season, in that like 60 to 70% route participation. But I'm with you. Like, I mean, look, I had Andrews as a target this year. I had to eat that L early in the season. Fortunately, I have him in best ball where he's been a much better fantasy asset. So you don't have to, because like, that's the other thing with Andrews, man, is that like we sit here, and I talked about this a little bit on my live stream with my patrons this week, but with Andrews, the first 4 weeks he was terrible, like not playable, but we were playing him, right? Like I always try to think about the psychology of a start sit, and the first 4 weeks with Andrews, we're not playing him at all. And then week 5 comes, we're like, well, we're not going to play Andrews because he's been horrible. He has an okay game in week 5. And then the next week you're like, oh, I can't really play him because, he hasn't been good all year. And then he has a touchdown. Like he pulls a streak together of like scoring a lot of touchdowns. But it wasn't until last week that we really saw like the good peripherals, like the Mark Andrews of old, if you will. And that's the only thing that would scare me with Andrews is like, are they going to use him, or is this an Isaiah Likely annoyance thing? Moving forward, I think that he'll at least be efficient enough to be like a top 10 guy, at the end of the day. But
yeah, I don't know. I do think it's interesting, at least, that he did see that role expand so much, because I had wondered if they were just not going to do that, if it was health related or something.
Yeah,
I thought there was a chance that he would stay in sort of the same role and Charlie Kolar would play more. I think they like him. He's somebody who has some talent and has made some plays this year.
Yeah.
But they didn't. They just like let Andrews be the guy. And so I think it's possible that with the playoffs approaching, they do kind of shift back to what we've seen in the past.
Man. Yeah, I hope.
Another guy I wanted to bring up through the lens of first downs per run is Terry McLaurin. And I'm really curious, JJ, to get your thoughts on McLaurin, because my thoughts are very jumbled. I have no idea what to make of him. But he is just behind Juwan Jennings as the wide receiver 6 in first downs per run. He's been integral to the offense in the red zone, and just in this instance in converting first downs. On one hand, it seems impossible that he can continue to score like half of the Commanders' receiving touchdowns. Yeah. On the other hand, it's kind of seems impossible that the Washington Commanders are going to like continue to only score rushing touchdowns. I do feel like Jaden Daniels is probably good enough to score more than like 0.8 passing touchdowns per game or whatever he's at right now. And so like I'm curious like what you make of Terry, because he's been really, really consistent, which is that's atypical for him. And it's not necessarily come on like a huge target increase. His target rates are higher than they've ever been. His first 3 target rates higher than it's ever been.
Sure.
But like, I just don't know what to make of the guy. I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
No, I think that your point about how they're scoring touchdowns is very, very important. They right now, I just pulled it up. They have 11 passing touchdowns. This is pre-Thursday Night Football. They have 11 passing touchdowns and 18 rushing touchdowns. Their pass to touchdown rate, if you will, is 38%, which is by far the lowest in football. Philadelphia, actually, who they're playing tonight, they're second lowest in the league. But the thing that I've always been intrigued by is by comparing that number, which is how teams are scoring touchdowns, to their overall pass rate. Because usually there is some correlation between teams that it's not super, super strong, but there is some correlation between pass rate, so how pass heavy a team is, to how they're scoring their touchdowns. So obviously a team that's throwing the ball a lot will probably see a lot of their touchdowns come through the air versus on the ground. And right now they, I have a very just a linear formula of expected passing touchdown rate. And right now their number's at 38%. So again, they have 11 passing touchdowns out of 29 total touchdowns. It should be closer to 55%. So there is that regression that should hit in terms of how they're scoring their touchdowns. So to me, the McLaurin thing is kind of moot, where he should see a smaller share of their receiving touchdowns versus, there is some touchdown regression coming from that perspective, but you also have to factor in how they're scoring their touchdowns, and how they're scoring them is not through the air. Now they're going to skew more towards the ground a little bit because they have, a run heavy approach, and, they're the most run heavy team in neutral game scripts, according to some ways of measuring that. Obviously Jaden Daniels can steal some touchdowns too, as a mobile quarterback, but we should see this revert a little bit. And so if it reverts a little bit and they start to throw for a little bit more touchdowns, even if McLaurin's share isn't as large, he can still maintain what he's doing. I don't think he's going to be better than what he's doing, but I think he can at least maintain it.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm at.
That's where I'm at too. As far as overrated metric, I thought the matchup points that you and Dwayne brought up were really good. I think there's a ton of double counting that comes into effect. And I've been guilty of that for sure. When I first found the matchup data, it's basically the same story that you and Dwayne told. You just get obsessed with it. It's so fun.
Yeah.
At this point, I try to keep it pretty simple, where it's just like the extremes. I think that press coverage information is really interesting, and that's something that gets a little bit overlooked because it's not publicly available. Like, it's not even on Fantasy Points data. And that's something that will hopefully become more mainstream. But like, there are some receivers like George Pickens, for instance, completely dominates against press, and that's no surprise. And there are some defenses that use press coverage like 80% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little, it's a lot more prevalent than like man coverage, where the most used is like 50% and the average is like 20%. Like press coverage, the average is like 50 or 60%. So I think that is something to keep an eye out for in terms of matchups. But overall, I think matchups, we're doing a lot of nothing. The other overrated metric in terms talking about doing a lot of nothing is running backs rushing stats. I feel like there's so much context being missed with what happens at the line of scrimmage. First off, I wish we could just have some better rushing stats, and I think that will come in time, hopefully. But even then, like, rushing efficiency is just overstated for fantasy. Like, less than half of PPR production at the running back position is the result of rushing yardage, which that's just, like, nearly 60% is receiving or touchdowns. If you look at the top 10 in fantasy running backs, like 4 of the 10 have pretty brutal rushing efficiency metrics, like Kyron Williams, Devon Achane, Breece Hall, Alvin Kamara. And why is that? Is it because they've been bad? No, I think they've all been really good this year. I think it's just because rushing efficiency metrics are mostly fake. They're fun. They are descriptive. Like, and like, you can like point to Bucky Irving's rushing metrics and Tyrone Tracy's rushing metrics and like show what they've been good at and how impressive what they've done is and all of that. But for fantasy purposes, like, if you care about them at all, you're probably caring too much.
Yeah, I've railed against this for years at this point. One of the things I do tend to do is at least look at similar situations with players on the same team, right? So like, I think it was glaring early in the season to see how much better Chase Brown was than Zach Moss. Like when it's so unbelievably obvious, right? Like when it's so, and then, there's other things like, oh, do they trust him in pass pro and blah, 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 that you can talk about. But like, just like as a player, and I think we saw it a little bit with Bucky Irving earlier this year with Rachaad White, where White has just been a pretty inefficient runner on the ground. But again, like I was a Rachaad White guy last year, because people were fading him due to the rushing metrics, like due to how inefficient he was on the ground. But like it just doesn't matter.
It did not matter at all.
It doesn't matter.
Was the same story, was not efficient as a runner at all, was a running back for in fantasy.
Exactly. It's just, it's not nearly as big of a deal as people think. Whenever you have, especially when you have a good pass catching profile like he does. And even right now with Rachaad White, like he's not going to lose a role in this offense because he has a pass catching, acumen. Like he's always been, dating back to college. He was a great pass catcher in college. Like, this is not a thing that is just going to disappear and go away. I can say that I'd prefer Bucky Irving over Rachaad White because of X, Y, and Z, which, that's for another day. But like I never really bought into like Irving just like taking over everything in that backfield, because when a running back shows off a skill set that's more important to the game of football, which is catching the ball in the backfield versus running it well, to me, what's replaceable is the rushing part for the most part. And unless you're someone who's just like ungodly efficient and it's just very obvious that, you're just a very, very special back. But yeah, I'm with you.
I think Bucky Irving is so good at everything that he could basically take over the backfield. And when I say that, it's not 100% obviously, but like 65%, and including being the main guy on passing downs as well, because he can pass block and he's a really good receiver.
He's good as a receiver too. Yes.
I think it's possible they might just realize like he's better at everything.
Yes. And look, I in my mailbag episode, I literally talked about this, where like, not only do I think that they could just use him more because he's the rookie, they want to see what they have, all that kind of stuff, and he's been really, really good, but also their schedule down the stretch really favors a runner, an efficient runner, more than the negative game script, long down and distance kind of running back that Rachaad White has become.
We just brought that up.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just think it's really interesting. I looked at Vegas look-ahead lines, and the Bucks were only 22nd in projected points from this point on, and I'm like, that's crazy. They're 5th in points. What is that about? It's because the over-unders in their games are like the 3rd lowest or something.
Yeah, I believe
And it's that they're projected to win all these games, but it's going to be low-scoring games because it gets the Giants and the Panthers and stuff like that. And so, like, that scares me a little bit for Mike Evans. But, like, really, the takeaway, I think, is, like, this is exciting for Bucky Irving. It looks like a lot of game scripts are set up really well for the lead back, the rushing back.
Yeah, exactly. And like, that's what I'm really saying, though, about Rachaad White, is that we want running backs in fantasy football because we're going to be wrong predicting game script all the time. We're going to be wrong with predicting how a game is going to go down. We can say with confidence Tampa Bay is going to go 2-0 against Carolina. They'll beat Dallas, blah, 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 blah. But we don't know for sure that's going to happen. And so out of our fantasy running backs, we want the guys who are on the field no matter what, right? And I don't think that we're going to get to that point with Bucky Irving this year, where if they are in a negative game script, it then becomes more of the Rachaad White show, which is what we've seen over the last month. But to your point, my point is, I mean, the schedule looks like, on paper, this looks like it could be the Bucky Irving takeover. Like, it could be that happening. I just, it's still, I don't think ever this season going to be the full Bucky Irving takeover of, even in those bad game scripts, he becomes like the dude in that back.
I could see it being like Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears split, where White.
Yeah, right. That's a really good example. Yeah.
On the Chase Brown note, did you see that he was a pass protector much more than he's ever been this past week? Josh Norris tweeted out the pass pro reps. He looked good. They used him more that way. He was running back 1 in route rate this week.
Yeah, baby.
So yeah, we're cooking. Like, we're some really exciting stuff. I was a little bit hesitant after the week before. People were ready to disappoint him because he had 32 touches or whatever. But like, those roles didn't change that much. But if they're going to trust him in that role, then it's like, yeah, this is like a top 5 potential running back. The Bengals, I think, were 3rd or 4th in projected points from now till week 17.
I think that one of the most overrated things in football is running back pass protection. And the reason I say that is because my belief is that there are going to be guys at the extreme who are really, really good at it and really, really bad at it. But the delta between the guys, the guys who are ranked like 5th to 95th, like not the edge guys, but just the majority of running backs, the true delta between how good or bad they are at pass pro is not significant enough to play the inferior player, right? Which is why, like with Chase Brown, after his slow start to the season in fantasy, one of my transactions was to hold him, because I think logically, sure, Zach Moss is, quote, better in pass pro than Chase Brown, but Zach, you're still losing something by playing Zach Moss over Chase Brown. You're still losing the talent, the ability, the big playability, all that kind of stuff, whenever you're playing the inferior player. So this isn't a take that's like coaches believe it. I don't think coaches believe this at all, because we see it all the time where they're using the, quote, better pass protector over the other guy. But I think a lot of times they're just not giving the other guy enough reps to be able to show that they're not significantly worse than the guy who's in front of them. And so I'm hoping that more coaches realize it, because I think it could end up being an edge in a way where you're kind of like, you're saying to yourself, like, yeah, I mean, intuitively we should want the guy who's better in pass pro, but realistically, I don't think that the payoff is really there at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I didn't have any Chase Brown this year because I wasn't confident in his ability to do anything other than be an early down back. And the Bengals passed so much that I was like, not really that interested in that.
Yeah, and Zach Moss. I mean, Zach Moss gets hurt, and so it's been a good run out. And then the guy they replace Zach Moss with is really kind of like a Chase Brown duplicate. Yeah. And so it's like all right, well, I guess we're riding with Chase Brown now. But anyway, all right, we've gone way over. Jacob, I really appreciate your time. It was really fun chopping it up and getting kind of high level and not really, throwing the player takes around. But let everyone know where they can find you and what you're working on.
At JA_Gibbs _23 on Twitter. Google my name or FFT newsletter and check out my free newsletter if you like this, advanced data stuff. That's what we're doing over there. Beyond the Box Score on YouTube. I just started that podcast and it's been a lot of fun. We've had really, really cool guests on. Nate Tice, I brought him up. He was on you could listen to us talk. There's a lot of evergreen stuff in that one. It's Drake May and Jane Daniels and Marvin Harrison Jr. and all that kind of stuff that should be relevant for a while. So, check it out. And thank you so much, JJ. This was dope.
Yeah, of course. You guys can find my stuff over on lateround.com. As usual, make sure you're taking advantage of the underdog offer and make sure that you have a great week 11. As always, everyone, thanks for tuning in.